you talk about the importance of eyewitnesses. Okay. And in particular, in this book, you talk about the Gospels. So from your perspective and from your research, were the Gospels written early enough to have been written by actual eyewitnesses? And why does this even matter?
Well, so this is one of the things we see in our criminal cases, right? That somebody might pop up and say, hey, I was a witness to something. This doesn't happen for 30 years. Or I open a case 30 years later. And then I see that someone says, oh, yeah, I was there. I saw something, too. And they want to offer something. Well, the first test, of course, is, well, are they lying about whether they were there or not? Because, it's not unusual. The tricky thing about witnesses is sometimes people will lie and say things that aren't true. And we're trying to evaluate what is true. And so a lot of times they'll say something because they want to help out somebody in their family who's been accused of a murder, or they want to, maybe this is a high publicity trial. They want to be part of a high publicity trial. So they'll pop up and say they saw something when in fact they were not even there. And we have to spend a lot of time testing whether or not they were even there. Well, that's kind of what I suspected was the case with the Gospels. I mean, look, if you wanted to lie about Jesus, here's how you do it. You wait till everyone who is dead, who was there at the time, is dead, and then you can say anything you want. If it's 150 years after the fact, there's not going to be anyone around to fact check you. No one else going to be around to call you a liar, because you're writing it so far. And a lot of skeptics, this is the position they take. They believe that the Gospels are so late, written so late. You hear this all the time on social media. If you're making a case for Christianity on Twitter or on Instagram or wherever you might be on social media, get ready. At some point, someone's going to say to you, these things were written 150 years after the fact, and we don't even know who wrote them, and the names that are on those Gospels aren't even the real names of the writers, blah, 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 blah. I needed to know up front, how early can I date these? Because clearly, if I'm going to write these 150 years late, that is a problem. You can't call them an eyewitness account, even though they might contain some truths. I need to know, was the writer available as an eyewitness? Now, some of this, they don't even attempt to be the eyewitness, or don't even claim to be the eyewitness. Like Luke, for example. Luke is the eyewitness during the book of Acts, and he even slips into first person. But when he writes his Gospel of Luke, he writes that saying, hey, I wasn't here for this. I instead spoke to the people who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so this is the kind. So again, I can now test this to see, well, how is Acts written early enough that Luke could really have known these people and have really talked to the people who knew Jesus personally? Could he really have been an associate of Paul? Could he really have been an associate of Peter? Could he really have been an associate of James, the brother of Jesus? Could he have spoken to these people? That's going to matter to me. I think what you can do is you can kind of work backwards from Luke's book of Acts. There's a lot of stuff missing from the book of Acts that Luke should have included. The destruction of the temple, the siege of Jerusalem, the death of Peter, Paul, Barnabas, James, the brother of John. You name it. There's a bunch of folks who we know about when they died. And they are important players in the book of Acts. All four of those men were important players in the book of Acts, yet Luke never mentions their death, even though he mentions the death of a true nobody, James, the brother of John. Sorry, that dude, compared to the other four, is a nobody. You never hear what James did in the book of Acts, okay? James, the brother of John. But you do hear what James, the brother of... Wouldn't you include that death? If you're going to include the death of James, the brother of John, why wouldn't you include the death of James, the brother of Jesus? Well, if it didn't happen yet, if it hadn't happened when you're writing the text, and none of those deaths started to occur until about 61 AD, well, then you can't write about it. The fall of Jerusalem is around 70 if it hasn't happened yet. So that means I'm tentatively placing the date of Acts at around 60, and I think you can actually move it earlier, but I'll place it at around 60. And now by the way, we're already within the lifetime of eyewitnesses. And you might think, well, wait a minute. 30 years later, you expect me to believe that somebody recalls something true. That's what I do for a living. I often find witnesses who 30 years later will come into trial. They'll make a claim about what they saw 30 years earlier. Now, what's interesting about those claims is defense attorneys will say, well, hey, how can you know? How can you remember from 30 years ago? Well, I will simply redirect and I will ask the question, well, how many murders have you seen? I've only seen one. But think you'll ever forget the fact that you saw that? You think it's it's kind of an unusual situation, right? Well, yes, it is. But you think you'll ever forget what you saw on the day you saw the one and only murder in your entire life? Yes, I will remember that forever. Okay. Right. certain memories are more stick in your head. And by the way, when I'm working with a witness who comes into trial 30 years later, there's a good chance that witness really hasn't shared that information all that much with that many people. If every day or every several times a week you were telling the same story over and over and over again, you're going to remember it a lot better. And what we have with the accounts, even if they're 30 years after the fact, and I don't think they are, I think you'll see in my book, I date Luke into the early 50s, I date Mark into the late 40s. And so if you look at that, even if you said, well, 10, 15 years have gone by, well, yeah, but don't forget, these folks transmitted this information orally from the minute Jesus ascended, as they were commissioned as eyewitnesses. From the first pages of the book of Acts, they were telling the stories of everything that Jesus taught and did and how he rose from the grave. And then at some point, they simply had to put that on paper or on papyrus. So it's not as though they hadn't thought about it in 30 years, and now suddenly they've got to recall it, or they hadn't told anybody in 30 years. We're in an oral tradition in the earliest centuries, and these folks repeated their claims often and wrote the Gospels within the lifetime of people who could have debunked them, who could have said, hey, I knew Jesus, and he was none of that. The early dating of the Gospels goes a long way toward validating the Gospel, but for me, it was only one part of 4 issues that had to be examined.